Gas fitter exam cram session, video 20. Okay. Fuel gas piping for other than dry gas conditions shall be sloped not less than 1/4 inch in 15 feet to prevent traps. We established that wet gas has moisture in it. This moisture, we want to use gravity, slope the pipe just like we would slope waste piping, even steam piping. If we have a one pipe system where, or two pipe system where we got condensate and we want the condensate to go back to the boiler, there's a certain pitch we put the piping at. Let gravity do the work for us. Same here. The condensate's going to drip back to the drip leg, dirt leg, sediment trap, whatever you want to call it. 1/4 inch in 15 feet. Now, we want numbers to do a lot of work for us. I see 1/4. Where did we just see 1/4? We saw that 1/4 can be 1/4 of an inch every 15 feet to slope wet gas piping. Not really a concern of ours. Everything is dry gas now. But we also saw 1/4. 1/4 can be 1/4 of a PSI is equivalent to 7 inches in the manometer, correct? A 7-inch water column in the manometer. Now, I don't know if you caught this, but that's the number 7. Didn't I say something to prove my point about numerology, that you're only going to see 7 once, that unless it's a math problem, that you're not going to, that it's not going to occur in the code except once? Okay, well then how do I explain this 7? Alright, well, I would say maybe it kind of feels like you caught me a little bit. It's like, uh-oh. But then again, I did say appear in the code. That question about the 1/4 inch of a PSI and the 7 inches on the manometer, that's not in the code, so I slip out of that one. But I'm glad you tried to corner me on it, because it now reinforces something else that's still good for us. This 7 and this 1/4 are doing work for us, because here's the 7 that appears in an area that we weren't going to see a 7. Okay, technically it's not in the it's not in the code, so I'm still right. Still right. But more importantly, 1/4. Maybe you're saying 7 inches of the manometer. I got to remember that. I got to remember it's 1/4 of a PSI. It's like, well, it's not that hard to remember now, because now when you hear 1/4, not only is it a 7-inch column of water, it is also the pitch within 15 feet to prevent traps in a wet gas system. So 1/4 does 2 jobs for us. Good. Okay. Question 3. Gas meter piping shall be pressure tested as per the utility. I think this might be the 3rd time we got that question, and we know point of delivery is at the outlet of the meter set. That's our domain. Utility, they can deal with their own stuff. Okay, what pressure do you test it at? Let the utility say. Question 4. The shutoff valve shall be, in the same room as the appliance. We went over why that's such a good idea. And again, it's going to be within 6 feet. And the appliance valve shall be upstream of the union, because the union is downstream of the shutoff valve. Okay. Page 24. Question 5. A union shall be located within 6 feet of the appliance. 6. That's our magic number, okay? If this was a Schoolhouse Rock special, we'd have the song 6 is a magic number. You got 6 foot flex, you got 6 foot union, you got 6 foot valve. From the appliance 6, it's a magic number. Okay. Question 6. The maximum spacing for 3/4 inch horizontal gas piping is 6. right? Is it 6? No, I'm wrong. It's 8. 8. It's going to be 8 feet. Why is it going to be 8 feet? Because we established that the smallest size we worry about is 1/2 inch. And then the largest size we worry about is 1 1/4, because from that point on is the same interval, and then in between the two sizes that are left over is 3/4 and 1 inch. And there were only 3 intervals we concerned ourselves with, and we used our cadence. Our cadence was 6, 8, 12. 6, 8, 12. So this has got to take the 6. This has got to take the 8. This is going to take the 12. So it's 8. 6, 8, 12, 8. 8 for 3/4 and 1 inch. Question 7. The maximum spacing for 1 inch horizontal gas piping is, just went over it, 3/4 and 1 share, 8. And I think you can notice, because these are questions from the exam, but not necessarily in that order. And I kind of tweak them a little so that as you're doing them, you're not just answering questions, you're also getting conditioned to seeing patterns. And here, I asked you 2 questions, and you'll start noticing, you do this enough, oh, wait a minute, 3/4 and 1 are the same thing. So 8 does double work for us. It takes care of 2 sizes. 8-foot intervals. Now, what would be the interval for vertical 1 inch piping? It would be the same as for any other size piping, because vertical, every floor. Okay. Question 8. Gas service piping outside a structure shall be buried not less than, this is our blanket statement, not less than 24 inches below grade or 2 feet. Okay? And what was the one exception to that? We were allowed to go as shallow as 18 inches as long as we weren't running it under a driveway and we're protecting it from any kind of damage or freezing if it's wet gas. Okay? All right, question 9. Digital gauges used for gas tests shall have a minimum reading of 1/100th of a PSI. We went over digital gauges, so I just want to reinforce the places past a decimal so that you're more familiar with it, more comfortable with it. But if I got 100, right? This is the ones, tens, hundreds. That's why this is 100, because it's 100. Ones, tens, hundreds. But on the other side of the decimal point, where we get the pennies, because if this is 100, once we put the point there, I could say it's $100. $100.50. Well, that would be $100.50. But things are a little different here. We don't have a ones. We have the tenths, right? And then we have the hundredths. Okay, the hundredths. So what the question is asking, what is the minimum reading on a digital gauge that's going to have a dot? Okay, it's digital. Well, the minimum reading would be that as far as the spacings within the gauge itself, on the front of the dial, it looks like a calculator almost. You have to have at least 2 spots past the decimal. That second spot is the 100th spot, so it would be, they want a minimum reading of 1/100th of a decimal here. So it's got to read 2 spaces. And the pressure you would have, let's say we have 3.52. This is the 1/100th spot. That's a spot that can fluctuate up and down. The 5 should always stay 5 to prove that the 3 is 3. That's how we account for a digital reading. Analog reading. You have the tick mark. You have the arrow. The dial. The dial shouldn't move past the tick mark. Okay? But the dial might go, maybe it goes a little bit over here. Maybe it goes a little bit over there. Within the tick mark, it'll go a little over. You know, you wear your glasses or whatever, magnifying glass, you look close enough. It could move a little bit, but we know if all of a sudden that tick mark goes, that needle of the dial goes past that, off the mark, we know we got a leak. The way that looks like in digital form is, this can change. This can go up and down. It's still within the tick mark. If the 5 changes to a 4, you have a leak. That 3 is invalid. If this just leaves the tick mark, you know, even just a little, just slightly leaves the tick mark, that invalidates the 3. This may be 3, but that's not 3. That's less than 3. This may be 3, but if the tenths drops, that's not 3 anymore. This can go up and down. That's okay. That's its job. That's why it's 1/100th of a decimal spot. Okay? All right. Question 10. Unless incorporated as part of gas burning appliance, a sediment trap shall be installed downstream of the appliance shutoff valve. We're going to remember this as anything that has to do with the appliance is going to be downstream of the appliance shutoff valve. The shutoff valve is to completely isolate that appliance and everything pertaining to it. So, that sediment trap is for the appliance. It's going to be downstream of the appliance valve. Okay. Question 25. Page 25, question 11. Gas meter and surface piping are covered in Appendix E of the New York City Fuel Gas Code. We went over the easy way to remember it is gas meter. Appendix E, there's an E in meter, Appendix E. Question 12. Gas piping shall not be installed in public corridors and exit enclosures except at the lowest level. I'm going to read through these choices and we're going to spend some time on this because now this is a tricky, nasty little section that you need to pay attention to. You will get asked questions on this and you got to feel comfortable with it because there's a lot of stipulations here. There's going to be a lot of blanket statements and then a lot of exceptions. And then the exceptions have exceptions. Okay, so first we become exposed to it, you know, get over the shock of it, and then little by little we'll keep adding to the exceptions because this one has exceptions upon exceptions upon exceptions. All right. Gas piping shall not be installed in public corridors and exit enclosures. That's the blanket statement. So, let's say we have an apartment building with a beautiful lobby. Okay? No gas piping in the ceiling of that. Let's say we go to the upper floors, you know, the corridor, where, you know, now all the apartment doors are there. You find the one that you want to knock on or you have the key to find, whatever. But within that, no gas piping. Okay? Exit enclosures. Exit enclosures, the stairwells, fire exits, stuff like that. No piping, no gas piping. Okay? So you're going to keep it out of public corridors and exit enclosures. Except at the lowest level. The lowest level we can have it if, and I'm going to tell you right now, all of these apply. So I'm going to read them and they all apply. At the lowest level, in residential buildings that do not have floors below grade. What are we talking about? The lowest level, well, that's going to be the lobby. That's how you get into the building. You find the elevators or the stairs or whatever. So, do not have floors below grade. What's a floor below grade? That's your basement or your cellar. Normally, your gas will come into the basement, the meter set is in the basement, and then you run it in the basement and send it up into, you know, send up your risers as close as possible to where the gas is needed. What if you don't have a basement? What if you don't have a cellar? Well, you got to make the horizontal run somewhere so you can take your branches off for the risers. The only space you really have left is going to be a public corridor. So, in residential buildings that do not have floors below grade, so generally apartment buildings, when gas pressure within the corridor gas piping does not exceed half a psi, so your basic system, your cooking gas system, so gas for the stoves and the living units, we're going to be allowed to run the main horizontal branch in the public corridor so that we can take off our risers, because we're never going to go over half a psi max working pressure. And if the piping is welded. Wow. So, we said that in a half psi system, we can use threaded piping up to 4 inches. We can use a 4-inch threaded fitting. But according to this, guess what? Even though we have a half psi max system, if we're going to run the piping in a public corridor, because we don't have a basement or cellar to run it there before sending the risers, we're forced to. There's really no other way to do it. We're going to have to send it through the first floor, the lowest level, the public corridor. We can do that, but in any of the public section, the lowest level, that piping is going to have to be welded. Okay, it's a 2-inch horizontal branch, and then we're taking off 1.25 risers. Is it in the public corridor section? Then code says we're going to be welding 1.25 and 2-inch piping on a half psi system, where we knew that was going to happen if we were working with anything over 5 psi, but look what can happen in the code. If you're not paying attention, you're running that piping and then you gotta rip it all out because, well, you didn't realize, if it's in the public corridor, it's gotta be welded. Now, there's 2 main types of welding you would do. You would do butt welding. You know, that's your classic where, you know, the ends of the pipe are chamfered. You know, you tack weld them together, you fill them with 3 passes, you know, so you got the arc welder, you know, the guy with the stick welding, or you could do TIG if you're running stainless steel pipe. But you're always going to, inside the pipe, you're always going to leave some kind of burst, some kind of something. So you're really using that kind of welding, stick welding. You're using that for larger diameter piping. Let's say you're working with 2-inch and smaller sizes. You're going to socket weld it, because, you know, it's the same thing as when you're soldering copper. You stick the copper into the fitting and then you solder. Well, here you're sticking the steel pipe into the steel fitting, and then you're putting a bead weld at the joint, a fillet weld right at where the pipe and the fitting meet. You're welding that, because if you start stick welding on small diameter piping, that burr does start to make a difference. Okay, but you will be welding it, so you're going to see socket fittings. Okay. Okay, so all 3 conditions must be met if you're going to run gas piping in a public corridor or exit enclosure at the lowest level. Okay, if you're at the lowest level, you can run it in a public corridor, exit enclosure, and only because you didn't have a basement or cellar to run the horizontal lines. Only because the system is not going to be the working pressure of the system is never going to be more than half a psi, cooking gas, stove gas, and you're going to be welding all of that. Anything considered in the public section of that lowest level, you're going to be welding it. Okay? And Here we go. Just when you thought that, your test pressures were done, no, you got one more. And they asked this question, and it's a good question. It shows if you were paying attention and you did hit every single dark corner of the code. Question 13, testing pressure for public corridor piping. Because we fulfilled all the conditions in the previous question, we cannot turn on until we test it. So, what's the testing pressure for? Testing pressure for public corridor piping shall be 10 psi for a minimum of 30 minutes. Let's go over the test pressures again, because until you can vomit at the mere thought of a certain piece of information, you have not gone over it enough. We will go over this until you get nauseous at the thought of it. Then you looked at it enough. I didn't say it was going to be pleasant. I didn't say it was going to be painless. I said it was going to be effective, and I said you're going to pass this exam. That's all I said. But it's going to hurt. Okay? All right. Testing pressure for public corridor piping shall be 10 psi for 30 minutes. So, I'm going to put the 10 psi here for 30 minutes, okay? This is an exception to the testing pressures that we learned in our table that we're gradually going to keep whittling down to some kind of memory shorthand that we can quickly just list out the numbers, and then we worry about what the numbers mean depending on the question. As long as we know all the numbers are accurate and correct, the rest follows, we're going to be good to go. So 10 psi for 30 minutes for a corridor, okay? Corridor piping. Anything in the public corridor. Now, I could see the logistics might be a little iffy, because let's think about this for a moment, right? We know that the only reason we were allowed to do this is because this is the cooking gas. This is to the stoves, to the units, because it said we can only do this in a residential building. So I'm going to say anything above are units, apartments, condos, whatever. But the units, why would you need gas up there? I would say the range, the stove. So cooking gas. Cooking gas is half psi max system, usually quarter of a psi at any time in the system, and raises it 7 inches in the manometer, the water column, right? But that's just in the public corridor. Once we took our branches off and started going into non-public spaces, non-public corridor, and into the units themselves, that's not in the public corridor. So we don't have to weld it. Nope. Didn't say we had to weld the whole system, just the part of it that's in the public corridor. Well, then we don't have to test that whole system at 10 psi, just the part that's in the public corridor. You could see, if you start thinking about it, well, but they're all attached. Okay? So, at what test are we going to run it? Well, I would say if we had a situation like this, and when we're running the piping and the risers, we're going to start from the point of delivery, run everything out, then branch off, then go up, and then make our connections. I would say in order to test the public corridor section that's welded, you probably would have to build the public corridor section, weld it, and then cap everything off, test it at 10 psi for 30 minutes, get that logged good, okay? That section of piping passed, and then continue to build your system so that once your system is done, now you test it at just your 3 psi. Okay, because I mean, unless you want to, you want to say, I guess you could also say, well, since the code says the distribution system is going to be tested in its entirety, because it does say that. When we get into testing, that's another stipulation. They want to test it in its entirety. An argument could be made, well, you got to test the system all at once, and even though you only need to test a half PSI system at 3 for 30, you have a section that requires 10 for 30. Is it possible you may have to build the whole system, keeping in mind that you're going to be testing at 10 PSI, so it's even more critical that you don't have a leak? You know? That's possible too. That might be an easy way to get around it also. Have the whole system pass at 10 PSI. If it passes at 10 PSI, you've satisfied the 3 PSI mark. They say 3 PSI is the minimum. That's what you can test at, but you could test at 10. If it holds at 10, it holds at 3, it satisfies it. The logistics are interesting, but the most important thing now, and what they're going to ask, they're not going to ask for this, all this stuff I'm talking about. It's just something to think about. You know, they're asking for the test pressure for the corridor piping, 10 for 30. So 10 for 30. So let's put this in perspective with what we already knew and take a chance to review. What's the smallest system we're working with? A half, and we know that's 3 for 30. 3 for 30. 3 PSI for 30 minutes. Now, what's the next level? The next level we said was going to be up to 5 PSI. And we remembered that these two we can put together in that 5 is going to be 50, 5 and 5, 54, 30. 30 is good for us, right? And then we drew a line because the next level was going to be an hour, but now we know we don't have, I would say you could keep this by itself as an exception for when that question comes, because the general testing pressures, that's the one that are easier to learn together. But that line we drew, well, we could say we actually have 3 situations where the 30-minute is viable, okay? And after 5, we said our next level was up to 15, and up to 15 was a full 100 for an hour, and then over 15 was double the max working pressure, which of course, whatever it was, whatever we came up with, can never be less than 100 for an hour. That's our basic chart, and now you see where this new little bit of information fits into it. But it is an exception. It's kind of a little out there that I usually just, you know what, this one you're gonna learn it by, you can learn it by itself. You don't have to, you know, for this information, these are the main pieces here, the main numbers. This one here, when you get questions on corridor piping, you know it's kind of like its own little world. It's going to be 10 for 30, okay? And it fits in our table, so. Let's see. Okay, question 14. When an appliance is installed on a sloped roof with an edge of more than 30 inches above grade, a level platform shall be provided for servicing at each side requiring access. In addition, oh, I definitely got this question. In addition, handrails at 42 inches high shall be provided. Okay? I can leave that. I'll leave that up there for a little bit. All right, the main number here is 42. What was the other main number? The other main number was 30 inches. 30 inches above grade. If the edge is 30 inches above grade, that unit has to have a level working area at the access points of the unit. So, you know, you have somewhere to stand, crouch, you have somewhere to put your tools, etc. And now, if we're putting this platform there because anything more than 30 inches above grade is a safety consideration, well, you know that no matter where you go, you also have to have handrails, you know, and if we're talking about scaffolding, then you even got to have toe guards and this and that. But